Our guest is John Thavis. He's covered the Vatican for 30 years and formerly served as the bureau chief for the Catholic News Service. John is the author of the Vatican Diaries, a behind-the-scenes look at the power, personalities, and politics at the heart of the Catholic Church. John, good to sit to talk with you.
My pleasure.
You've been covering the Catholic Church now for 30 years. How do you see it?
I'm a faithful Catholic. A lot of people who knew me back in the day said, "You've been at the Vatican for 30 years. How could you keep your faith?" And, they were serious. I still see the Catholic Church as my church, kind of in spite of all the things that I've witnessed at the Vatican. I've seen people who have stumbled upon scandals. I've seen people who have done some disservice to the church. I've seen some incompetence at the highest levels where you would not expect it. And yet, in the area of faith, I don't think that it's changed me that much.
Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of a big picture, which is the general mission of the church, and then there's how it all works from the inside, huh?
Well, how it works from the inside was basically my job to cover for 30 years. And indeed, it was fascinating to watch how things happened or didn't happen, or happened in ways that were not supposed to happen. And part of the reason I wrote my book was that I felt that the general population has a kind of caricature image of the Vatican. They see it as a monolithic power structure where the orders come down from on high, everything is executed in lockstep fashion, and they see it largely as a very efficient machine. I knew from the inside that this is not the way things work. And part of what I liked about the Vatican was that it is, in fact, a very human place, which means that you're going to have mistakes. You're going to have people appointed to jobs that perhaps they're not great at. You're going to have people stumbling along the way. And I wanted to tell all this in a book and make the place more real and more human.
Mm-hmm. You've done so, and you've focused in, and this word just pops out over and over and over again, Curia. What is the Roman Curia? What is the Vatican Curia?
It is the Vatican bureaucracy. The Roman Curia is kind of a catch-all phrase, actually. If you asked even Vatican officials to define it, they might have trouble, because the Roman Curia has grown up over the centuries, kind of by accretion. You have some agencies of the Roman Curia that have traditions that go back hundreds of years, and they have their own sense of authority that sometimes leads them not to be so cooperative with other agencies in the same Roman Curia.
You're suggesting there's some infighting, there's some turf battles going on?
Well, there are constant turf battles, and in ways big and small. One of the things that led me to write this book was in 2005, there was a conclave, as you remember, and we reporters covering it were told that the white smoke, which is always gray or black or white, you never really know, they said, this time we're going to have a fail-safe. As soon as there's white smoke, the bells will start ringing. So we thought, okay, that's good for us. Kind of takes the fun out of it. But, well, in fact, white smoke appeared. No one really was sure, and the bells were not ringing. They didn't ring for 20 minutes. Afterward, I wondered why. How was it that they kind of stumbled upon this very basic piece of papal choreography? I went and found the bell ringer, and he told me why. He said because he got a phone call to ring the bells, but it wasn't from his boss. It was from a Swiss guard, and he did not take orders from a Swiss guard.
Wow.
These are ancient turf battles. He worked for the Basilica of St. Peter's, not for the Swiss guard, not for any other Vatican agency.
Now you said Basilica, and all of a sudden jumped into my mind the basilicas that are allegedly the resting places of St. Peter and St. Paul. But there's a little bit of, well, we're not quite so sure about that. Is there a lot of that going on?
Well, there is what I call in my book the politics of the bones. St. Peter's Basilica was built on top of the tomb of St. Peter. We all know that, and most Catholics accept that. It's been certified by popes, but it wasn't until Pope Pius XII that they actually excavated beneath the Vatican and discovered the first century Roman cemetery. And they found a tomb that was marked by the name Peter, and they said, this is definitely Peter's tomb. The debate came in when they found some bones that had been scattered around the place and didn't quite know what to do with them. These were not professional archaeologists. And unfortunately, the bones were put in a box, rediscovered years later by another archaeologist, who then took them to the Pope, who said, well, all right, I think they're St. Peter's bones. And there's been controversy ever since.
In your book, and I don't want to let this go by because we're talking about turf battles, there are a couple of instances of, the Legion comes to my mind, where really ultra-conservative wings of the church are fighting with the liberals in the church.
These battles were real and probably are still real. In the case of the Legionaries of Christ, whose founder, Father Marcel, was later discovered to be not only a pedophile but a fraud. He had been married to at least 2 women and had a double or triple life. It's hard to believe that church officials did not know about this, and yet apparently most of them did not. Some did. He had protectors inside the Vatican. He had
in high places.
Very high places. He had people who were inclined to protect him because, after all, the Legionaries of Christ were the most successful religious order of the last 50 years. They were the only religious order delivering, 50 or 60 new priests for ordination every year. They were held up as the success story. And it was very difficult for the Vatican to say, it looks like your founder was a fraud, and therefore that calls into question your entire order.
So they have universities, they have seminaries, success, but protected by the Pope, huh?
Protected very much by Pope John Paul II, who genuinely believed that Father Marcel was not only a successful founder of a religious order, but a very holy man. There are many people who have questioned John Paul II's record on this, and they think it's a blot on his record. And in some ways it probably is. There are others who say that by the time the evidence came out about this priest, John Paul II really was not being informed of everything that went on at the Vatican. This was in the last few years of his pontificate, and the Pope himself had gatekeepers. There were people preventing the bad news from reaching his ears.
Let me take a little break. The Vatican Diaries, John Thavis's book, behind-the-scenes look at the power, the personalities, and the politics at the heart of the Catholic Church. Take a little break. Back on the other side with John. Sit tight. This is America and the World. This is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services. John, look at the last 3 popes, John Paul, Benedict, now Francis. What each of them, what were their missions? What were their goals?
John Paul II was the Pope of the modern age, I believe. And he evangelized in a very public way. He was a globetrotter. He was an actor by training, and I think he was very much at home on the global stage. He became a world figure, largely by the force of his own personality. And I think he wanted to take the church to parts of the world where Catholics were still an unknown quantity. And he did so very successfully. As we know, Africa blossomed as far as Catholicism went under his pontificate. Pope Benedict, I think, took a different tack. I think he presided over identity building inside the Catholic Church. He was not so much concerned about going to the outlying regions as to building up the base. And to Pope Benedict, that meant building up doctrinal formation among not just theologians and priests, but every Catholic. Pope Francis is going in a different direction. Pope Francis is saying that the church has to change the way it evangelizes. It must truly listen to people, it must be in dialogue with people outside its own borders, and it must, above all, share the sufferings of your average parishioners and average people outside the church. It was unusual and interesting in one of his recent interviews that Pope Francis was asked, what are the main challenges facing the church today? And he said, unemployment among youth and the loneliness of old age. It caused a lot of Catholics to scratch their heads and say, these are the problems facing the Catholic Church? Well, these are ordinary problems. That's the point. This Pope, Pope Francis, was very close to his people in Argentina, and he wants to remain so as Pope. He is more tuned into the pastoral realities, the kind of life and suffering and struggles that everyday Catholics are living.
He's a people person.
He
huh?
really is
Yeah.
a people person. And the very first thing he did was take a tour of the papal apartments, and he nodded and said, very nice, 300 people could live here. And he decided right then and there, not for me. And it was not so much that the papal apartments are opulent. You know, they're not that fancy, to be perfectly honest. And the Domus Sancta Martha, St. Martha's residence, it has marble halls and marble walls, so it's not the most Spartan of places to live either. But geographically speaking, it is a world away, because the papal residence is inside the Apostolic Palace, which is surrounded by Roman Curia officials. The Pope would have been imprisoned there as his predecessors were, and he wanted to be able to go where he wanted, to have guests, to have people coming and going, even to sit down and eat meals with others.
What do we make of this team of, I think, 8 cardinals from around the world as advisors? Is this something that's dramatically new?
It is dramatically new, and it's very astute, I believe, by Pope Francis. One of the first things he did was name 8 cardinals to advise him on matters of church governance. Now, the cardinals elected this man in part to reform the Roman Curia. That much we know. The way he's going about it, I say, is astute, because instead of forming a big commission or calling a huge meeting involving all Vatican offices, he simply named 8 cardinals, and 7 of them do not work for the Vatican. Only one does. So in reforming the Vatican's bureaucracy, he is not turning to the usual suspects. John Paul II tried to reform the Vatican. He basically gave up after 15 years. There was too much resistance.
And the one he chose from the United States was not the cardinal from New York that everybody had their eye on, but the cardinal from Boston, who's kind of cut from a different bolt of cloth.
Well, Cardinal Sean O'Malley is a Franciscan.
Yeah.
I think there's probably a vibe there. You know, I'm sure that Pope Francis gets along with Cardinal O'Malley. Number one, the Franciscan charism of Cardinal O'Malley probably counts for a lot with Pope Francis. And, you know, he too has taken a vow of poverty. As the Archbishop of Boston, he has given up the Archbishop's mansion, for example. And I think he feels that Cardinal O'Malley's probably on his wavelength.
And O'Malley was brought in to replace Law, who was at the heart of all of the scandals, huh?
Cardinal Law presided over the eruption of the sex abuse scandal in the Boston Archdiocese in 2002. And Cardinal O'Malley really cleaned it up as much as could be done. I think that's probably another reason that he was appointed. I think he's seen as someone who faces that issue in an honest way.
Where does the Catholic Church stand with this whole business of pedophilia?
Well, for the most part, the Catholic Church is still recovering from the wounds that these cases inflicted on it. I, in my book, give Pope Benedict credit for the steps he took to address the issue, and I think he deserves some credit. He was the one who pushed to make crimes against minors, the sexual abuse of minors by priests, as categorized as one of the Church's gravest crimes, which meant that the doctrinal congregation could bring them in and defrock them. And this was a huge move. Unfortunately, it took many years to implement, and even now, the processing of cases is very slow. I think where the Church stands now is that it has to make sure that the norms adopted by various bishops' conferences become universal. I think it has to speed up the processing of cases. And it really should look at mismanagement by bishops. Very few bishops have lost their jobs because of the way they handled these cases. And for that reason, there's a perception, even among Catholics, that there's been a lack of accountability.
Take us, for folks who are watching our conversation who are not Catholics, the pecking order that goes, pecking order is not the right way to say it, I'm sure, from priest to Monsignor to bishop and onward.
Right, priest, Monsignor is really a title, an honorary title that the rumor is Pope Francis may suppress that because, you know, why heap honors on the clergy? But there are priests, there are monsignors, there are bishops, and then there are archbishops, and then there are cardinals, and then the Pope.
How many cardinals are there?
There are about 200, and only 120 of them, the maximum number of 120, are voting age members. And there's a lot of talk that Francis may change that. I see no reason why he couldn't change it. The College of Cardinals is one of those institutions, although it's about 1,000 years old, it was not a divine institution. It was not instituted by Christ. Its rules and membership have changed over the centuries and could change again. You know, in fact, people have suggested, why can't there be women cardinals? Why can't there be lay people as cardinals? Well, there could be. It would require a change in rules.
I was thinking of a book that a priest gave me a number of years ago that was the history of the papacy. There's scandals all throughout the history of the papacy, huh?
Many. And most of those scandals took place in the Middle Ages when the popes assumed temporal power. They ran what is now the state of Italy, the Papal States. They made deals with other emperors and other kings. They were very much world political players. I think that really over the last few hundred years, we've seen very, very little of this. The number of scandals, at least among popes, have been very few. And I think nowadays Catholics expect the Pope to be a holy man. And perhaps that's why we're seeing so many of them propose for sainthood recently.
Let's talk a little bit about sainthood. What qualifies a person to be considered for sainthood, and what are the steps?
Well, basically a person, you know, the Church says it doesn't create saints, it only recognizes them. But it has a long, involved process of recognition. And generally speaking, what really counts is that this person had a reputation for holiness and had a kind of ripple effect among people whose lives were touched by this person. Say Mother Teresa, for example. You know, she touched many lives, and many people were convinced she was a living saint. And therefore, her cause was introduced at the Vatican. Normally, it's introduced at the local level where people lived, and then once that's concluded, the case is sent to the Vatican where they study it. And if they believe that, in fact, this person really lived the Catholic virtues, the Christian virtues, heroically, then they look for a miracle, the first miracle. And if they find a miracle, that person can be beatified. If they find a second miracle, that person can be canonized.
And the definition of a miracle is?
Well, that is that's a bit of a controversy as well, because, you know, a lot of people will call things miracles that on a moral level could be a miracle. A conversion can be a miracle. What the Church looks for is something that cannot be explained by science. In other words, that's why medical miracles are the predominant miracles of today. they're the easiest ones to say, well, this is unexplained. You know, if there's a spontaneous cure of an incurable disease, and doctors say, we don't have no idea how that happened, that will probably be accepted as a miracle.
Who's on the fast track right now to become saints?
Well, we know that the canonization of John Paul II and John the 23rd is now scheduled for April 27th of next year. Those are the next big profile canonizations.
And do they both deserve it?
Well, you know, who am I to judge, as Pope Francis might say.
That's right.
You know, certainly John Paul II had a tremendous impact on people, and certainly he was a very holy man. No one doubts that. This was almost the private side of John Paul II, is that he had a mystical approach to prayer, and he would pray for hours, prostrate himself on the floor. He would do penance. He would do all kinds of things. Behind his public persona was a very deep spiritual life.
And self-flagellation?
Self-flagellation was something that came out kind of well after he died, and it disturbed some Catholics, to be honest. They thought he was whipping himself, you know, and yes, he was, according to one of his closest aides. That was something that was not known about him, and that seemed to some people to contradict what the Pope himself had said about appreciating the beauty of the body, the spirituality of the body. And so that remains a kind of a question mark in a lot of people's mind.
And John the 23rd?
John the 23rd was still awaiting this second miracle when suddenly Pope Francis decided, we're going to waive that requirement. He's a saint. Everyone knows it, and I'm going to canonize him the same day I canonized John Paul II.
Wow. And what was his claim to fame? Remember that for me.
John the 23rd was the Pope who convened the Second Vatican Council.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, John the 23rd, of course, was much loved, and that was
Yes.
probably an equal claim to fame. He would give these wonderful, beautiful, off-the-cuff sermons to hundreds of thousands of people and leave them in tears. They would go home and think, what a great human being
I
this guy
remember
was.
him being very warm, a
Very
very
warm.
warm person.
Very warm, very human. And it's interesting that our new Pope, Pope Francis, I think, is looking to him as his model.
Ah.
Very much so, in style and in substance. I think he sees himself, he wants to be as warm as John the 23rd, and he wants to be the Pope of Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, the Pope who really runs with the Second Vatican Council.
And I gather from what I've read so far and interviews that the Pope has done, and you just referenced, who am I to judge, when the issue came up on judging gays, lesbians, transgendered people. I mean, what a thing for the Pope to say, who am I to judge? And that was an amazing statement. And now, secondly, coming along on that, is this business of, you know, we're not in the business of trying to convert everybody to our way of thinking. And maybe a third thing that he said is too much talk about sex, too much talk about that area. There are more, I can't say more important things to do, but there are more important things to do.
Exactly. This is an earthquake for the Catholic Church.
An earthquake.
Yes.
Tell me.
Well, we've gone through 30 years of identity building and identity politics in the Catholic Church. You know, the biggest project of John Paul II was revising the Catechism. That was so that everyone could have a doctrinal compendium, 850 pages. And it was as if every Catholic should be looking at this quite often. I don't think many Catholics were. And this is what Benedict used as his calling card when asked, how do we attract people? Here, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Well, at the same time, you had Vatican officials declaring that some moral issues are non-negotiable, and that if you can't agree with these, you can't really call yourself Catholic. And these issues were abortion, euthanasia, gay marriage, among others. And so you had a period of time when, you know, church leaders appeared almost like copyright lawyers protecting the Catholic brand name.
Yeah.
You had theologians who lost their ability to teach at a Catholic
Yes.
university. Some Catholic universities and hospitals that lost the right to call themselves Catholics. And there were even some Catholic politicians who lost their place in the communion line. All this suddenly seems to be gone. Pope Francis is saying, no, we're not going to focus on just a few select moral issues. We're going to first go back to what the church was set up for, which is saving souls. And the way we do that is convince people that the gospel has meaning for them and that Jesus saved you.
The Vatican Diaries. What a wonderful, it was a real treat to read this book. Congratulations on this, John, and it's so wonderful to have you fly in to be with us today.
Dennis, my pleasure.
Thank you so much, John. For information about my new book, The Chance of a Lifetime, and online video for all This Is America programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net. And now you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.